She had not heard the knock at first. The scrub brush was too loud against the hearthstone, and the morning too gray, and she had learned in 8 months of widowhood to stop listening for sounds that belonged to another life. It was Dorcas who heard it. Dorcas, who appeared in the doorway of the great hall, with her apron twisted in her fists and her eyes gone very wide, and who said, in a voice that was barely a sound at all, "Your Grace, there is a carriage in the courtyard, a crested carriage." Cecily Barrow, Duchess of Nortwell, sat back on her heels. Her hands were raw from the lye soap. Her morning gown was the gray wool she wore for indoor work, the hem darkened with water. She had dismissed the housemaids 3 months past, when the quarterly accounts had made the choice for her, and she had taken up the brush herself with the particular dignity of a woman who has decided that survival is not beneath her. The hearthstone was clean. She intended it to stay so. She looked at her hands. She looked at the doorway where Dorcas had not moved. "A crested carriage," Cecily said. "Gold on black, Your Grace. The crest has a leopard." She knew that crest. Every person of consequence in England knew it, though most of them would never see it in their own courtyard. She had seen it once, in the procession, the summer she was presented, when she had stood at the edge of the crowd with her father's hand at her elbow, and watched it pass, and thought it belonged to a world so distant from her own that it might as well have been painted on a screen. She rose from the floor. She set the brush in the bucket. She did not look for the housekeeper who was no longer there to take it from her. "Tell whoever it is," she said, "that the Duchess of Nortwell is at home." She had not yet understood who had come, or why, or what he would see when she opened the door herself, because there was no footman left to open it. She would understand all of it very soon. She did not know, standing there with water still dripping from her cuffs, that what she was about to open was not merely a door. The man on the other side of it had not come to witness her reduced circumstances. He had not come to offer charity or to acquire what a dead duke's creditors had not yet stripped. He had come because the Foreign Secretary had run out of any other option, and because Lord Ashby, His Majesty's ambassador to the court of the Two Sicilies, had a memory that had not released a single detail of a conversation held 4 years ago in a garden in Bath, when a young woman with no title yet had told him in plain, unhurried sentences precisely what England's diplomatic posture in the South would cost if it did not account for the trade routes through Palermo. He had been right to remember. The season in London that year was the 4th of the long peace, and Nortwell House in Grosvenor Square had been, for precisely one winter, the most talked-about address in the city. Edmund Barrow, the 9th Duke of Nortwell, had been 53 years old when he married Cecily Latham at St. George's, Hanover Square, in a November ceremony attended by 3 earls, a bishop, and a quantity of creditors who had come to assess the new Duchess for signs of intelligence. She had been 24. She had given them no signs of anything except composed good manners, which they had mistaken for simplicity, as people of that class reliably do. Edmund had been kind to her. That was the precise word, and she had always used it with precision. He had been kind and curious about her opinions, and grateful for her willingness to manage the household accounts, which were considerably more disordered than he had represented at the time of their engagement. He had been fond of her in the way one is fond of a person who treats one's intelligence as a real thing rather than a conversational accessory. He had died in February, 14 months into the marriage, of a fever that arrived without warning and departed without him. He had left her the house in Grosvenor Square, £6,000 in various encumbrances, and the title of Duchess Dowager, which Edmund's nephew had been at some pains to remind her, carried no claim on any Nortwell property, beyond what the marriage settlement specifically named. The nephew was 21. His name was Robert, and he had a mother, Lady Eugenia Barrow, who had spent 11 years as the wife of the Duke's younger brother, and another 3, watching her son's inheritance shrink under the previous Duke's management of the estate. She had not been pleased by Edmund's marriage. She had been considerably less pleased by the £6,000 in encumbrances, which she considered a personal insult from beyond the grave. A woman who cleans her own floors, Lady Eugenia had said, at the card party she hosted 2 weeks after Edmund's funeral, while Cecily sat 4 chairs away, holding a hand of whist she had not the concentration to play, is a woman who never quite believed she belonged. She had said it to the Countess of Mallow, who had said it to Mrs. Stratton, who had said it loudly enough that it crossed the room. Cecily had laid down her cards. She had said, "I beg your pardon, Lady Eugenia. I thought the point of cleaning one's floors was that they should be clean." And she had said it without heat, which had been somehow worse for Lady Eugenia than if she had wept. It had not made them friends. The carriage in the courtyard was indeed gold on black. The leopard on the crest was rampant, the motto below it in a Latin she recognized from her father's library, who had been a schoolmaster in Wiltshire and had given her Latin along with French and Italian, and the habit of reading primary sources rather than summaries of them. She stood in the doorway of Nortwell House with her gray wool gown and her raw hands and watched the footman let down the step. He descended from the carriage without assistance, which she noted, because men of his rank rarely did. He was perhaps 35, tall in the way that reads as stillness rather than height, dressed in traveling clothes of a quality that would not announce themselves to anyone who did not know what they were looking at. His face, when he raised it, was the face of a man who had spent years in a warmer climate, with a particular economy of expression she associated with people who had learned to be careful in rooms where their reactions had consequences. He looked at her standing in the doorway. He did not look at her gown or her hands. "Your Grace," he said. His voice was level, unhurried. "My Lord Ambassador," she said. A pause crossed his face that was almost, but not quite, surprise. She had done her thinking in the courtyard, while the carriage stood there. "You know why I am here," he said. "I know who sent you," she said. "I imagine the why will take longer." She stepped back from the doorway. "Come inside. I will have tea made if you will not mind that I make it myself." He came in. He looked at the hallway, which was clean and nearly bare. The large urn that had stood beside the staircase, gone to the auction at Christie's Inn. January, along with the portrait of the 6th Duke, and the pair of Meissen figures that had watched over the drawing room for 60 years. He did not comment on the absence of servants. He took off his traveling coat and hat himself, and laid them on the side table. "I will tell you," he said, following her toward the kitchen, "that I arrived in London 3 days ago and called first at the Foreign Office. The secretary sent me here." "The secretary," she said, "has been trying to resolve the Palermo question for 2 years." She lifted the kettle from the hook and moved toward the pump. "He sent you here because someone told him I had opinions on it." "You told him," said Lord Ashby. "In this house, at the reception you gave in the spring of your marriage. You sat next to him at dinner and spoke for 40 minutes on the structure of the grain agreements and why they were about to fail. He did not act on what I said." No, the word was flat and carried its full weight. He did not. The agreements failed in the autumn. The Palermo merchants transferred their arrangements to Genoa. The route is now controlled by 3 families who do not like England and are not, at present, inclined to become fond of it. He paused. "The secretary believes you may understand the families in question better than anyone. Currently employed at the Foreign Office." She pumped the water. The sound of it was very ordinary in the quiet kitchen, and she was glad of it, because it gave her hands something to do while her mind moved through the implications. "Because my father was a schoolmaster," she said, "who spent a winter in Palermo in 1804 and brought back Italian as a going concern and 3 volumes of Sicilian trade history that I read when I was 12. Because," he said, "you are the only person in England who has read the primary sources and has the social standing to sit across a table from the Marquis di Villanova without him dismissing you in the first 6 minutes." She set the kettle on the fire. She turned to look at him. He was leaning against the kitchen doorframe, watching her with the particular quality of attention she had noticed in the courtyard, and not been able to name until this moment. He was not watching her circumstances. He was watching her think. "You want me to go to Palermo," she said. "The secretary wants you to go to Palermo," he said. "I want to know whether you are willing." The distinction was small, and it was everything. She registered it and did not let it show. She set out 2 cups. She did not have a great deal of good china left, but what she had was sound, and she used the sound things without apology. "Tell me," she said, "what the Foreign Office is prepared to offer." She listened. She asked questions that Lord Ashby answered with care and without condescension. She asked a second set of questions that made him pause and revise something in his face, as though he were correcting an estimate he had arrived at before he knocked. The tea was ready. She poured it. He took the cup without remarking on the absence of a tray. "I should tell you," she said, "that the Marchese di Villanova does not negotiate through intermediaries. Whoever sits across from him must be willing to begin the conversation in Sicilian, which is not the same as Italian, and to speak for at least the first quarter hour without reference to England's commercial interests. I was not aware of that condition, he said. He told my father so in a letter I have upstairs in the study. She looked at her cup. Would you like to see it? Yes, he said. They went upstairs. The study was disordered. Stacks of correspondence on every surface, the ledgers open to pages covered in her careful notations. She moved 3 volumes of Debrett's from the chair by the window without apology, and retrieved the letter from the 3rd drawer of the secretary, where she had filed it under V 6 months ago when she had gone through her father's effects. He read it twice. Your father corresponded with him for how long, he said. 7 years, from 1804 until his death. The letters are yours. They are mine. A beat of considered silence. Outside the window, the Grosvenor Square garden was winter bare, the iron fence gray in the flat light, 2 pigeons walking the path with their particular industrious purposelessness. There are people, he said, who will object to the appointment. The secretary's office contains at least one man who will argue that a dowager duchess has no standing to conduct diplomatic business. He is wrong about the standing and correct about the precedent, she said. I would be the first, I am aware. Does that change your answer? No, she said. It clarifies it. He looked at her then with the full version of whatever that quality of attention was. She had the sudden sense he was not revising an estimate downward. He was revising it upward, in the rapid, disconcerting way of someone who had set their expectations carefully and was finding they had not set them carefully enough. I should go, he said. The secretary will want my report by this afternoon. He did not move immediately. He looked at the letter in his hand, then handed it back to her. Palermo in March is cold in the mornings and warm by 11. You will want the Italian wool, not the English kind. She did not say that she had 2 Italian wool gowns left and had been considering selling one. She said, I know Palermo's climate. Yes, he said. You would. Lady Eugenia Barrow had maintained a correspondence of impressive volume since her brother-in-law's funeral, and the news of the ambassador's visit reached her before the ink was dry on Lord Ashby's report to the Foreign Secretary. She arrived at Nortwell House the following morning with her companion, Miss Hartwell, and was shown to the drawing-room by Dorcas in a clean apron. Lady Eugenia looked around the drawing-room. She noted the absence of the Meissen figures. She looked at Cecily, who had come down in the dark blue morning gown, and who had sat in the chair nearest the fire without offering the warmer one. I have heard, said Lady Eugenia, a very peculiar story. I imagine you have heard several, said Cecily. They are saying that the Foreign Secretary has proposed to engage the Duchess Dowager of Nortwell as some sort of diplomatic person. Lady Eugenia said it with the precision of a woman who has chosen each word for its wounding potential. A woman who cleans her own floors is now, apparently, to advise the government on foreign affairs. The Foreign Secretary has offered me a consultancy, Cecily said. I have accepted it. You cannot be serious. I am always serious about matters of professional consequence, Cecily said. It is one of the things Lord Ashby noted in his report. Lady Eugenia drew herself up. She was a tall woman, well made, and the gesture had served her effectively in every drawing-room she had entered for 30 years. You are not equipped, she said, with great deliberateness, for this kind of work. You were a schoolmaster's daughter before you were a duchess. You will embarrass Robert's name and Robert's title, and the 9 generations of Barrows who built what you have so efficiently dismantled. Cecily looked at her. The fire was warm at her left side. The letter from the Marchese was in the secretary drawer upstairs, and she had read it so many times across so many years that she could recite it in full, including the 3 paragraphs in the Sicilian dialect that her father had written in the margin to explain the nuances. I have dismantled nothing, she said quietly. I inherited a house with £6,000 in debt, and I have reduced it to £4,260 in 8 months by managing the accounts myself. That is the opposite of dismantling. She paused. If you are worried about the family's name, I would suggest it is rather better served by a member who has been asked to do useful work for the crown than by a member who has not. Lady Eugenia left with her chin at an angle that suggested she was not finished, and she was not, and Cecily knew it. The preparations for Palermo took 3 weeks. Lord Ashby called twice in that time, once with the Foreign Office's formal documentation, and once on a Thursday afternoon when she was in the study working through the Marchese's letters in sequence. He stood in the doorway looking at the papers spread across the desk. "I came to ask," he said, "whether you had encountered the name Grimaldi in the correspondence." "Twice," she said. "My father described him as the man the Marchese trusts with his accounts and does not trust with his daughters." Something crossed Lord Ashby's face, not quite amusement. The possibility of it. The secretary's man in Palermo believes Grimaldi to be the principal obstacle. He controls the access. Then we will need to speak to him before we speak to the Marchese. She set down her pen. Grimaldi's wife is from a family in Messina. My father taught the eldest son of that family English in the winter of 1804. It is possible the family remembers him. More than possible, he said at the same moment she said it. He was looking at her in the way she had come to recognize, the upward revision. "Rapid, you know," he said, "that when we arrive in Palermo, my position will afford you formal protection that your own title, in that context, may not." "I am aware," she said. "The Sicilian aristocracy does not extend automatic courtesy to English duchesses. It extends courtesy to people who have been vouched for by people they already trust. And to people who speak the dialect. Yes, that too." He crossed to the desk and picked up one of her father's letters, read it for a moment, and set it down carefully, precisely where it had been. "Your father was a man of considerable gifts," he said. "He thought I would make a good schoolmaster," she said. "He could not have anticipated the alternative. I think he anticipated rather more than you are giving him credit for." She looked up at him. He was not looking at the letter. He had been looking at her for several seconds with the quality she had first seen in the courtyard, and she understood now what it was. Not assessment, recognition. The recognition of someone who has spent a long time in rooms where intelligence is costumed to suit the room's expectations, and who has just walked into a room where it is not costumed at all. He had come here on the Foreign Secretary's errand. But he was not looking at her as a Foreign Secretary's errand. He was looking at the room as though he wished to memorize the arrangement of the letters on the desk, the particular order she had imposed on her father's life's work. He was looking at the 43 volumes stacked against the far wall, the spines facing out, each one legible from where he stood. He had not chosen, at any point in this visit, to condescend to her about the state of the furniture, or the quality of the china, or the particular gray of the gown she was wearing, because it was the gown for working in, and she had not had time to change. She was aware, with the particular precision her body sometimes achieved before her mind had finished its reasoning, that she was quite warm on the side, nearest the fire, and quite still in the dress herself, and that she had not been either of these things in the same moment for a very long time. "He left me his library," she said. 43 volumes on Italian and Sicilian history. The auction house offered me £2, 4 shillings for the lot. I declined. "Good," he said, simply. Lady Eugenia's second campaign began the week before the departure. She had been thorough. She had spoken to the Countess of Mallow, who had spoken to Lady Stratton, who had mentioned at the assembly rooms that it was very odd, was it not, that the Duchess Dowager of Nortwell, a woman reduced to scrubbing her own hearthstones, had been seen twice in private company with the ambassador. The story circulated through the season in 3 days. Cecily heard it from Dorcas on a Wednesday morning. She stood very still for a moment, with her hand on the kitchen table, the wood cool and solid under her palm. Then she picked up the marketing list and finished it. She attended the Mallow dinner that Monday, 40 covers, in the dark blue gown, pressed twice. Lord Ashby was in the room when she entered, standing with Lord Mallow near the fire, and he saw her cross the threshold and looked at her in the way he had looked at her in the study. Steady and complete. She sat between a colonel who was primarily interested in the Burgundy and Lady Stratton, who was primarily interested in Cecily. "I wonder," said Lady Stratton after the soup, "that you are willing to show yourself in company just now. A woman who has been reduced to cleaning her own floors has no business accepting private appointments with an ambassador." The colonel on her other side reached for the Burgundy. Cecily said pleasantly, "Lord Ashby and I have met in my study to review correspondence relevant to our work, with my household present. If that is the subject of the talk, I confess I find the talk somewhat undernourished." Lady Stratton opened her mouth. "Lady Stratton," Lord Ashby's voice. He had come to stand at the edge of the table, which was unusual at a seated dinner, and the section of the table within earshot had gone quiet. He addressed her without heat, without apology. "I wonder if you would be willing to tell me the source of the account you have been sharing this week." It contains several inaccuracies I should like to correct." Lady Stratton looked at him. The color in her face shifted. "The Duchess of Nortwell," he said, "has been engaged by the Foreign Office to conduct diplomatic consultancy on a matter of significant consequence to the Crown. She is the most qualified person in England for the work." The appointments at Nortwell House were professional in nature and attended by her household. "If you have told people otherwise, I would be grateful if you would tell them again with the correct version." Lady Stratton said nothing. She looked at her plate. He returned to his seat. The table exhaled. Cecily looked at the piece of sole on her plate and found that her hands were quite steady and her face was quite warm, and she was not, for the first time in 8 months, uncertain whether the next 6 months would be survivable. She had not expected intervention. She had not asked for it. She understood, with a precision her father would have approved of, that what Lord Ashby had done was not rescue. It was correction. The distinction was again everything. Lady Eugenia made her final effort 2 days before the departure. She arrived without notice, and Cecily came down from the study and sat in the hall chair and invited her to sit in the other one. "Robert is deeply distressed," she said. "I am sorry to hear it," Cecily said. "He considers this appointment a humiliation. A woman who has been reduced to cleaning her own floors, going abroad as though she were some sort of government agent. It is not decent, Cecily. You carry the Barrow name now. You owe it something." Cecily looked at her. Lady Eugenia's face was composed in the arrangement it wore when she believed she was making an unanswerable argument. She had made unanswerable arguments for 30 years, and they had never yet been answered. The season had agreed with her too long for her to believe that a schoolmaster's daughter with red hands had anything in her arsenals that could change it. "I owe the Barrow name the same thing I owe my own name," Cecily said, "which is competence and honest work. I am going to Palermo because the Foreign Secretary has asked me to go, because I can do the work and there is no one else who can do it in the same way, because my father spent 7 years in correspondence with a man who trusted him, and that trust has been transferred to me, and it is not a thing I intend to waste." She paused. "Whether that is decent is a question I am content to leave to history." Lady Eugenia left without another word. She had come expecting a woman at the end of her resources who would flinch at one more push. She had found instead a woman who had made her decision before the ambassador's carriage ever appeared in the courtyard, and who had found, in the making of it, a solidity that Lady Eugenia had no instrument to measure. The Foreign Office arranged their passage. Lord Ashby called for Cecily at 7 in the morning, the sky over Grosvenor Square still dark and very cold. She stood in the doorway of Nortwell House for a moment before she pulled the door closed. The hall was clean. The hearthstone was clean. Dorcas was staying on at the reduced wage the Foreign Office stipend would now cover. He offered his hand at the foot of the steps, not as a gesture of form, but because the last step was iced and he had seen it, and she took it without making a ceremony of either the offer or the acceptance. His hand was warm through her glove. The journey south was 4 days. They spoke for most of it. He had questions that were good questions, the kind that could only be asked by someone who had read the same primary sources and arrived at adjacent conclusions by different routes. She had questions about the current state of the trade routes, the character of the Marchese's chief rival in the Merchant Council, the name of the family who held the notarial records for the port. He answered all of them without first determining whether she would understand. On the third evening, coming through the mountains above Naples with the snow still on the high ground and the sea beginning to show as a gray line below them, he said, without preamble, "I was in Palermo 2 years ago. I met the Marchese at a dinner. He asked me, before dessert, whether England had ever produced anyone worth talking to. I told him I was working on it." She looked out the carriage window at the gray line of sea. "That is a very honest answer," she said. "I did not think so at the time," he said. "I thought it was a diplomatic evasion. I understand now that it was a specific description of a specific deficiency that has since been corrected." She did not look at him. The sea was widening below them, the light on it very pale. "Lord Ashby," she said. "James," he said quietly, as though it were simply the more accurate word. She looked at him then. He was watching the sea, his profile in the fading light carrying the quality of a man who has said one careful, irrevocable thing and is waiting to see what the world does with it. "Cecily," she said. He looked at her. He did not smile, because he was not a man who smiled readily, but something in his face settled, the way a room settles when a window is opened and the air that comes in is cold and correct and entirely right. The meeting with the Marchese di Villanova took place on the second morning after their arrival. Cecily had worn the Italian wool gown and her grandmother's garnets, which she had kept when everything else went, because her grandmother had given them to her before her presentation, and because some things are not for sale. She began the conversation in Sicilian, as her father's letter had instructed, on a subject that had nothing to do with trade. She asked after the Marchese's nephew, whose name she knew from her father's letters, who had been 7 years old in 1804 and who was now 31. The Marchese looked at her as though she had done something he had not been told was possible. Then he answered. Then he asked how she knew of his nephew. Then she told him about her father. A pause of perhaps 20 seconds crossed the room. The Marchese looked at Lord Ashby and said, in Italian, "She is not what I expected." Lord Ashby said, in Italian, "No, she never is." The negotiations took 9 days. They worked through the evenings at the long table in their borrowed rooms, her notes on one side and his on the other, the lamp between them and the port visible through the shutters, the sound of the harbor carrying up through the stone walls, with a constancy she found companionable. There were cats on the sill of the open window, 2 of them, who appeared each evening with the certainty of expected guests. She had begun leaving a small piece of bread on the sill without discussing it with anyone, and he had noticed and had said nothing, in the particular manner of a man who considers noticing a private act. On the 4th evening he said, without looking up from the document he was correcting, "You are going to want to flag the second clause of Article 7. The notarial language will close a door. The Marchese's rival will try to walk back through in 3 years." She read the second clause of Article 7. She rewrote it in the margin, in Italian, with 3 words changed. He read her revision. He looked up. "Yes," he said. By the end of the 9th day, the agreement was in principle settled. The Marchese shook Lord Ashby's hand. He turned to Cecily and bowed with the particular depth reserved for persons of serious standing, which was not a category he had previously applied to an English duchess, and said in Sicilian that England had done better than he expected, and that he hoped England knew it. She said, in Sicilian, that she hoped so too. The return journey was 4 days, the road south of Rome muddy with the early spring. He told her about the 18 months he had spent in Naples before Palermo, and the letter he had sent to the Foreign Office that had been read and filed. She told him about the winter she had spent going through her father's papers in the schoolhouse in Wiltshire, reading the Palermitan correspondence in sequence for the first time since childhood. She had been 22. She had not known what to do with the understanding. She had come to London the following spring, which was where she had met Edmund, and where she had met Lord Ashby once, briefly, in a garden in Bath, in the early evening light, when the roses were in their second bloom, and she had been holding a glass of ratafia she had not wanted, and he had been standing alone near the garden wall, with the particular stillness of a man who goes to garden parties, because he is required to, and conducts himself there as though they are meetings of consequence, and does not complain about either condition. She had not thought he remembered. "I remember that conversation," he said. "I know," she said. "You told me. I did not tell you that I remembered more than the content." He looked at his hands clasped on his knee. "I remembered the manner of it. The way you built the argument. As though you had no concern for whether I found it acceptable, only for whether it was correct." I had learned by then, she said, that concern for acceptability tends to corrupt the argument. The light outside was the pale particular gold of early Italian spring. "There is a post," he said, "that the Foreign Secretary mentioned before our departure. A consultancy formally constituted rather than ad hoc, with a stipend sufficient to maintain a household of modest size." He paused. He also raised a second matter. He said that if you were willing, the work would be most efficiently conducted if the consultant were resident in the same household as the ambassador. He was careful to specify that the arrangement would require the appropriate social structure, by which he meant a formal one. Cecily looked at the Italian spring outside the window for a moment. "The Foreign Secretary," she said carefully, "is proposing that his ambassador and his consultant should be married." "He proposed it," said Lord Ashby. "I am asking it." She looked at him. He was looking at her steadily, without the formality he maintained in rooms where his reactions had consequences. His face had the quality it had carried since the first evening in Palermo, when the lamp was between them, and he had read her marginal notes with the same attention he gave a document from the Secretary of State. I should tell you, she said, that I have £4,260 remaining in encumbrances on the Grosvenor Square house. I should tell you that I have 43 volumes of Italian and Sicilian history and a correspondence of 7 years standing with the most important trade negotiator in the south of Italy, and that I intend to use all of these things in whatever work I do for the rest of my life, because they are mine and they are not for sale, and they are worth considerably more than they appear. I am aware of all of it, he said. It is precisely what I am asking. She looked at him for a long moment. The carriage moved through the spring fields, and the road was better here, and the thin gold light lay across the seat between them. James, she said. Yes, he said. Yes, she said. They married in late April at St. George's, Hanover Square, where Cecily had been married once before, the cherry trees in their brief, extravagant bloom. She wore the dark blue gown. Robert, the 10th Duke of Nortwell, sent a card but did not come. Lady Eugenia sent nothing. The Foreign Secretary brought 3 colleagues. Lord Ashby's solicitor sat in the front pew and looked satisfied. Dorcas, who had come up from Grosvenor Square in her best cap, cried throughout and was not ashamed of it. When he took her hand at the altar, he took it as he had taken it on the iced step, as a fact rather than a ceremony, and she understood that this was his mode with everything he valued, not the gesture but the act itself. There was a small breakfast afterward, and when the guests had gone, she walked through the rooms of the house on Curzon Street alone for a moment, learning their proportions. She found the study, which was a good room, south-facing, with shelves along 3 walls. The shelves were largely empty. She stood in the center of the room and thought about the 43 volumes in Grosvenor Square, the 7 years of letters that Dorcas would pack and bring over in the morning, and the 4th drawer of the new desk where they would go, filed under V. She heard his step in the hall. He came to the door of the study and stood there. The volumes from Grosvenor Square will need the south wall, she said. They are oversized in places. I know, he said. I measured the shelves yesterday. She looked at him. You measured the shelves, she said, before you asked me. Yes, he said. He had measured the shelves because he knew the books would come. He had known the books would come because he knew her. He had known her. She understood now, since the garden in Bath, since the 40 minutes at Edmund's dinner table, since the courtyard of Nortwell House, where he had come without announcement and stood at her door and waited. She crossed the room. She took his hand, which was warm and steady, and her grandmother's garnets caught the last of the evening light at her wrist. The deep red of them very certain in the quiet room. On the south wall, the shelves waited.